only 11 months. That is the time it took from his violent death to his canonization, making it the fastest canonization in history. The Golden Legend collects the stories of over 140 of the most venerated saints, but to him, it devotes one of the longest chapters. And so a natural question arises: who was Peter of Verona, also known as Saint Peter Martyr? In the classical world, power was everything. Whoever was the strongest, fastest, the most ruthless would win fame and recognition. Those who prevailed and made it to the top, emperors and kings, were honored as gods. As a sign of their success, they received a palm branch and a crown of laurel. That was the way things were ordered, the way they had always been ordered. The first were the first, and the last were the last. It is in this time of unmerciful competition that a Jewish rabbi was executed. A side note, nothing more, or so the powerful thought. But nothing would ever be the same again. Because this Messiah rose from the dead, and people who saw it with their own eyes began to tell about it. They did not take up swords. They did not plot to overthrow the old order. All they did was tell the truth. They were called martyrs, Greek for witness. Despite persecution, their numbers would only continue to grow in the centuries that followed. For their testimony, they paid the ultimate price and received the ultimate reward, the crown of immortality. It is July 23rd, Anno Domini 1164, when crowds of people flock to the city of Cologne. The city, by far the largest in the Holy Roman Empire at the time, is festively decorated. Joyful anticipation fills the air. It is a spectacle. And many wonder, will they even witness miracles on this day? What is the reason for the excitement? 2 years earlier, Emperor Frederick Barbarossa had besieged the rebellious city of Milan. When the Milanese finally surrendered, Barbarossa gave the order to plunder the city. The victor's spoils included precious relics, and the most precious of these are just about to arrive in Cologne. The bones of the so-called three kings from the Gospel of Matthew, the Magi who followed the star to the manger in Bethlehem, visiting the infant Jesus. So great was the enthusiasm for these relics that the stream of pilgrims continued unabated in the following decades, which ultimately prompted the construction of Cologne Cathedral to begin. Like so many of Europe's great cathedrals, Cologne Cathedral is basically a gigantic relic box made of stone. But what does all this have to do with Peter of Verona? Not much. Except that, firstly, Peter was born in precisely this fascinating period of the High Middle Ages, the time of knights, crusades, cathedrals, and monastic orders. Secondly, the veneration of Peter has a lot to do with the nature of relics and the miracles that emanate from them. and thirdly, the place from which Barbarossa took the relics of the Magi. Eustorgius, a noble Greek, was the bishop of Milan from 343 to 349. It was he who brought the relics of the Magi from Constantinople. They were a gift from Emperor Constantine II, son of Constantine the Great, whose mother, Saint Helena, once found them. A small chapel was built to house the relics in a cemetery of early Christians, outside the Roman city walls of Milan. Eustorgius not only kept the relics here, he himself was also buried in this place, which bears his name. Fast forward to the year 1233. The small chapel of St. Eustorgius had grown into a monastery of the Dominican order by the time Peter arrived here. An empty stone sarcophagus inside the church was a painful reminder of the loss of the relics 70 years earlier, an open wound. Peter did not know it at the time, but soon this place would once again house powerful relics, his own. When Peter arrived in Milan, he did not do so as a novice. He was in his late 20s and had already entered the Dominican order 12 years earlier, when the order had only been in existence for 4 years. This is an important fact to consider, for the circumstances that led him to take this step are the key to understanding who Peter of Verona was. As his name suggests, Peter was born in the city of Verona in northern Italy in 1205. Geography and time play a decisive role in this story. An episode from his childhood illustrates why this is the case. When Peter, only 7 years old, came home from school one day, his uncle asked him what he had learned. Peter replied that he had learned this: "I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible." His uncle then told him not to say that God had created heaven and earth, because the devil had created the visible world. But the young Peter stuck to what he had learned, and in return, put his uncle on the spot with wise arguments. Here, in a nutshell, we have the most important points laid out before us. Firstly, the aspect of learning. What Peter recites is, of course, the Creed, in Latin credo, the Christian confession of faith, and he learned it in a school. Secondly, the young Peter stood firm in what he had recognized as truth, was eloquent, and could defend himself with arguments. And thirdly, the uncle who claims that God created the invisible world, but the devil created the visible world. This dualism was characteristic of a heretical movement whose followers became known as Cathars, or Albigensians. And at the time of Peter, northern Italy was one of their centers. When you hear the word Inquisition, your thoughts may automatically go to the Spanish Inquisition of the 15th and 16th centuries, with all its inexcusable excesses. However, the Holy Inquisition existed long before and long after this. In fact, it still exists to some extent today, even though the name Inquisition was finally abolished in 1965 as part of the Second Vatican Council. Its spirit lives on in the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, which has the task of protecting the unity and purity of Catholic dogma, among other things. Its prefect from 1981 to 2005 was a cardinal by the name of Joseph Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict XVI. Even though the Inquisition rightly has a negative connotation today, it fulfilled an important task and played its part in making the Catholic Church the only relevant institution that has endured from antiquity to the present day. For from early times, the unity of the Church was threatened by divergent teachings. The major isms of their respective times were, for example, Montanism, Manichaeism, Gnosticism in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Arianism from the 4th century onwards. But it was the appearance of the Cathars in the 12th century that posed an unprecedented threat to the Church. What made them so dangerous? Well, first of all, the sheer number of their followers, and then the speed of their spread. The first occurrences of the Cathars can be traced in France around the year 1000, Toulouse in 1017, Orléans in 1022. However, it was in the 12th century that the great upswing took place. In Germany, the Cathars are first documented in Cologne in 1143, and from 1155 onwards, Catharism spread in Italy. As already mentioned, large communities formed, particularly in northern Italy. In fact, these communities had grown so large that they were about to establish a counter-church for the first time in Europe's history. And as it happens, there were also political implications. Although Catharism appealed primarily to ordinary people, there were many sympathizers among members of the nobility. This will become an important detail when we come to Peter's martyrdom. Tellingly, the Cathars or Albigensians, after the southern French city of Albi, never developed a unified belief system. What they probably had in common was a fuzzy idea of returning to an original, supposedly pure Christianity, from which they believed the Catholic Church had departed. The Greek word Catharos means pure. Above all, however, it was the aforementioned dualism that united all Cathars. In short, the devil, not God, created everything material, the visible world, exactly as Peter's uncle expressed it, and exactly as it contradicts the Christian creed. The Church had to react. It was the formation of a strategy for dealing with the Cathars that ultimately led to the emergence of the Inquisition. Its beginnings were surprisingly moderate. This is shown by an inconspicuous incident in the south of France that was to have a major impact. But from the beginning, in 1184, a council was held in the city of Verona of all places. At this council, Pope Lucius III and our old friend Emperor Frederick Barbarossa decided to take joint action against the heresy of the Cathars. The Cathars were punished with excommunication, exclusion from the Catholic Church and its sacraments. But that was not all. In the papal bull Ad Abolendum, Lucius III laid down the first legal framework for how bishops in particular were to deal with the Cathars. It has therefore often been argued that the Council of Verona was the birthplace of the Inquisition. Lucius III died just 1 year later in Verona and was buried in the cathedral there. 15 years later, on January 8, 1198, a 37-year-old named Lotario di Segni was elected pope. As Innocent III, he was to become one of the most important popes of the Middle Ages. Innocent, who had studied law in the up-and-coming university city of Bologna, continued the fight against the Cathars. When I say fight, it is perhaps surprising to realize what exactly this fight looked like. For at this early stage it meant debating, the battle for the better argument. Fascinatingly, Innocent only sent a small group of Cistercian monks to the south of France for this task in 1206. Among this group was the papal legate Pierre de Castelnau. They traveled through the regions of Occitania wearing modest clothing, preaching and arguing with the nobility in particular, who supported the Cathars in this region. But then, on January 15th, 1208, Pierre de Castelnau was murdered in the back. 8 weeks after his death, which was blamed on Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse, Pope Innocent III not only declared Pierre de Castelnau a martyr, he also saw no other way. In the same year, Innocent called for a crusade against the Cathars. This undertaking became known as the Albigensian Crusade. It lasted 20 years. Inglorious stops along the way were towns whose names have gone down in history because of the atrocities committed there by the Crusader army. The massacre of Béziers, the siege of Carcassonne, and finally the fall of the fortress of Montségur. Many French Cathars fled to northern Italy, but here too they eventually met the same fate. The fortress of Sirmione on Lake Garda became their last refuge, but in 1276 this fortress was also taken, and the surviving Cathars were burned at the stake in the arena of Verona. The Cathar movement experienced a final flourishing at the turn of the 14th century in southern France. However, the Inquisition in Toulouse quickly took control of the situation. The Inquisition in Toulouse was headed by a Dominican friar by the name of Bernard Gui, a name that may sound familiar to you, as the novelist Umberto Eco used it for the fictional character of the Inquisitor in his novel, The Name of the Rose. The year 1310 marked the end of the Cathar heresy. The Inquisition was successful. But let's rewind to the very beginning of the Inquisition and take a closer look at who else was among this small group of monks originally sent by Pope Innocent to set the Cathars straight. With words. Diego de Acebo, also known as Diaz de Osma, was Bishop of Osma in Castile, in present-day Spain, from 1201 to 1207. His Latin name is Didacus, derived from the Greek word didache, which means to teach or to instruct. Remember I said that the aspect of learning plays a key role in the life of Peter of Verona? We'll get to that in a moment. Bishop Diego, equipped with the fervent heart of a missionary, was entrusted with a mission of a, different kind in 1203. King Alfonso VIII of Castile sent him to Denmark to secure a bride for his son, Crown Prince Ferdinand. This mission was ultimately not to be crowned with success, but it led, coincidentally, to another, much more momentous mission. You see, on his journey, Diego, to his horror, passed through areas where the Cathars were very active. A second trip to Denmark followed in 1205, and his return journey took him via Rome, where he met Pope Innocent III. And in 1206, Innocent commissioned him to join a small group of Cistercians who were traveling as itinerant preachers in southern France to respond to the spread of Catharism with preaching and disputation. And this group was precisely the group around the papal legate Pierre de Castelnau, with whom the Inquisition arguably began. But Diego did not undertake all these journeys alone. Always at his side, his sub-prior, a young, eloquent man by the name of Domingo de Guzman. It is the future Saint Dominic. Bishop Diego, venerated later on as a saint, eventually returned to his diocese in Castile and soon died. But the young Dominic stayed behind in the region of southern France known as Languedoc, more precisely in the city of Toulouse. As a result of his experiences on his travels with Diego, He made it his life's mission to lead people away from the sin of heresy and back into the bosom of the Catholic Church. A wealthy citizen of Toulouse, impressed by Dominic's devotion, seriousness, steadfastness, and compassion, gave him and a small group of like-minded men a house in which they went on to live together as monks. The 6 brothers around Dominic initially lived according to the rule of St. Augustine. However, in addition, Dominic emphasized the importance of thorough study. He had recognized that, along with obedience and discipline, a good education in theology, and above all, rhetoric, was essential in order to be intellectually armed against the Cathars, and along with an authentic lifestyle, to convince them with arguments. In 1216, Pope Honorius III confirmed the foundation of a new order. Although the name Dominicans is common today, the actual name of this order is Ordo Predicatorum, Order of Preachers. A name that says it all. By the way, at exactly the same time, another shining light of Christianity was still waiting for the Pope to recognize the founding of yet another new monastic order, Francis of Assisi. Dominic and Francis probably even met during their stay in Rome. What they discussed is unfortunately not known. What is clear, however, is that the Dominican order and the Franciscan order, although they had things in common, such as a life of poverty, differed above all on one point: the emphasis on study. Therefore, the growing number of Dominic's confreres studied and taught in Paris and in the aforementioned city of Bologna. And it was precisely there, in Bologna at that time, just 4 years after the founding of the Order of Preachers, that a young man was studying the arts, who had already attracted attention as a child for his eagerness to learn and his eloquence. Peter of Verona. At the age of 15, Peter joins the order and receives the habit, the white tunic and the black hooded cape, which earns the Dominicans the nickname Black Friars, and distinguishes him from now on as a member of the Order of Preachers. He receives this outward sign of his lifelong commitment, this profession of faith in fabric form, from Dominic himself. Shortly afterwards, within a few months, Dominic died. Dominic, who is said to have spent his brief night's rest on the hard stone floor in the corner of a church, breathed his last in the bed of a fellow friar, as he did not have one himself. His new order then grew so rapidly that it was nothing short of a miracle. Within a few years, convents were founded in Italy, France, Spain, England, Germany, and even Scandinavia. Speaking of miracles, in addition to his great merit for the Church, Dominic worked numerous miracles, so it should come as no surprise that he was eventually canonized. But here's an interesting fact. Dominic's canonization took 13 years from the time of his death. Not a completely unusual length of time, yet somewhat surprisingly long given his status. In contrast, as we will see shortly, the process of canonization of Peter of Verona will take less than a year, the fastest canonization in history. Why is that? How did Peter of Verona become Saint Peter Martyr? We have now discussed the historical background that needs to be discussed in order to understand who Peter of Verona was. But one piece of the puzzle is still missing. And it is not a small piece. It is, after all, the most widely read book of the Middle Ages, second only to the Bible. And its story begins with a young man who, just like Peter, joins the Dominican order at the age of 15. Jacobus de Voracinae was born near Genoa in 1229. This means that only just over 20 years separate him from Peter's birth, and only about 120 miles separate him from Peter's birthplace. Jacobus followed a typical career path for Dominicans. He studied in Paris and Bologna, and eventually became a Magister Theologiae, a professor of theology. Even before he became Archbishop of Genoa at an advanced age, Jacobus was a prolific writer, or rather historian. He wrote a chronicle of his beloved city of Genoa, to which, incidentally, he had the precious head relic of one of the virgins of St. Ursula, transferred from Cologne of all places as a gift, which testifies to the lively, Europe-wide transfer of relics. The reason I have just emphasized that Jacobus worked as a historian has to do with the fact that the name of the work that was to make him famous was later given the name Legenda Aurea, Golden Legend. In the Middle Ages, the word legend did not mean something fantastic, but simply that which is to be read, as it was intended for reading aloud in monasteries and churches. As mentioned in the intro, Jacobus compiled the biographies of over 140 saints, and with them, a virtually inexhaustible wealth of miracle stories. Quite the scholar, he lists the numerous sources from which he draws for his work. You are, of course, free to look at it with the skeptical mindset of a modern person. But even if you are of the opinion that the Golden Legend is mere poetry, you might want to consider what the great Aristotle, who played a central role in medieval scholasticism, has to say about it. Aristotle believed that poetry explores universal truth, while historiography only attempts to record specific events. He therefore considered poetry to be the more excellent undertaking. For medieval man, and this is the important point, there was no sharp dividing line between history and fiction anyway. What makes the chapter on Peter of Verona so special is the fact that at the time of Peter's murder, Jacobus was already working on the Golden Legend. He therefore had very fresh source material at his disposal, both in terms of documents relating to his murder, but also reports of the miracles that took place around Peter's relics very soon after his death. The temporal proximity and the fact that Peter, like Jacobus, was also a Dominican explains the elevated status of Peter in the Golden Legend. And based on Jacobus's account, we now come to the event that made the monk Peter of Verona Saint Peter Martyr. Starting from the aforementioned monastery of Sant'Eustorgio in Milan, where he lived from 1233, Peter preached remarkably effectively throughout Upper and Central Italy. As the episode from his childhood with his uncle already indicated, he was particularly talented at refuting the heresy of the Cathars, with arguments. Even more effective in converting the Cathars was his exemplary holy life. Because of these qualities, Pope Innocent IV appointed him inquisitor for the dioceses of Milan and Como in 1251, and also prior of the monastery in Como in the same year. Shortly afterwards, on April 6, 1252, Peter traveled from Como to Milan with 3 fellow friars. In the forest of Barlacina, paid assassins attack the group of travelers. One of the murderers strikes Peter on the head with his sword. A second sword blow ends his life. His companion, a fellow friar named Domenico, narrowly survives the attack and dies 5 days later, so that he can report details of the crime. and what he reports is as follows. After the first blow with the sword, Peter sank to his knees and, close to death, began to recite the creed, the credo, which he had learned as a child, and with which this story began. Blood begins to gush from his wound. When his voice fails, Peter dips his finger in his own blood and begins to write the holy word on the ground. Credo. Despite extensive investigations, the background to this murder plot was never fully clarified. What is clear is that the murderer, a man named Pietro da Balsamo, was hired by influential Milanese families who were close to the Cathars. Balsamo, who was caught at the scene of the crime by a peasant, later escaped from prison and joined the Dominican order under an assumed name. He did penance for his crime and was later beatified himself. Peter of Verona was buried in Sant'Eustorgio. The Golden Legend tells of the large number of miracles that emanated from Peter's relics immediately after his death. It also reports that the attempt to eliminate the most gifted preacher of the order of preachers backfired. Peter, who suspected that money was being put on his head, did not hide away, but persistently and kindly stood up for the truth. And when the hour of his death came, he accepted it, patiently. I suppose that's why I chose Peter of Verona for the first episode of this series. His martyrdom has a strong symbolic meaning because it happened at a critical point in history, when true faith was in danger of fading. His death strengthened once again the determination of the faithful to remain true to their faith, despite adversity. The Church of Sant'Eustorgio in Milan, if you remember, is the church from which Barbarossa took the relics of the Magi almost 100 years earlier and transferred them to Cologne. Now, in the very same year of Peter's death, a man known as Albert of Cologne was teaching in the city of Cologne. A German Dominican monk who, how could it be otherwise, had studied in Bologna and Paris, and as Albert Magnus, was to become one of the greatest philosophers of the Middle Ages. But it is his exceptionally gifted student, whom Albert Magnus had as his assistant in Cologne at the time, that I must mention briefly before concluding this video. Perhaps the greatest Dominican of them all, and the greatest theologian of the Church. His name, Thomas Aquinas. You see, the Church of Sant'Eustorgio not only has the remains of St. Peter Martyr, but also the thumb of Thomas Aquinas' right hand. It is said that he wrote parts of his famous Summa Theologiae during a stay in the monastery of Sant'Eustorgio. The thumb represents the art of writing, and is therefore not only a fitting relic for this monastery, but also a fitting symbol to once again capture the essence of this story. In his Summa, Thomas Aquinas, who was of course to become a saint himself, writes about the veneration of relics, quote, "We believe that the bodies of the saints, and above all, the relics of the martyrs, which are members of Christ, should be worshipped in all sincerity." And he goes on, "We ought to honor any relics of theirs in a fitting manner, principally their bodies, which were temples of the Holy Spirit, and are destined to be joined with the body of Christ in the future resurrection. God fittingly honors these relics by working miracles at their presence." End quote. And it is precisely these numerous miracles that make the chapter on St. Peter Martyr in the Golden Legend so special. I can only encourage you to read the Golden Legend. It is a gift to us from the Middle Ages, a testimony to the piety of the time. It breathes the learned spirit of the Dominicans and is as elegant as a Gothic lancet window. So, what do we make of all this? Did the Church go too far in its fight against the Cathars in the end? Absolutely. But it is a complex, multifaceted story. To avoid the trap of an overly one-sided critical account, as is often promoted by modern secular historiography, I recommend Henry Charles Lee's standard work, A History of the Inquisition of the Middle Ages from 1887, which provides a fair, balanced account of all the circumstances that need to be considered about the Inquisition. In it, he writes about Catharism in summary. Quote, "Such was the faith whose rapid spread throughout the south of Europe filled the Church with well-grounded dismay. And however much we may deprecate the means used for its suppression and commiserate those who suffered for conscience' sake, we cannot but admit that the cause of orthodoxy was in this case the cause of progress and civilization. Had Catharism become dominant, or even had it been allowed to exist on equal terms, its influence could not have failed to prove disastrous." End quote. And that is the whole point. Not for the first time, faith was under threat, but perhaps never before so seriously. Henry Charles Lee also points out that the Church itself was to blame for the danger threatening it. Indeed, the Church itself even admitted it. The clergy's neglect of duty and moral corruption fed the heresy. The founding of monastic orders, such as the Dominicans, with their emphasis on discipline, exemplary behavior, seriousness, and spirituality, were a response to this. Naturally, the high ideal of the early days could not be maintained forever, and evil gradually found its way into the growing order. But throughout history, there have always been these shining figures that people could look to for guidance in this eternal struggle. And that brings us to the underlying question of this series. Why care about martyrs like Peter at all? First of all, you may want to keep in mind that the Christian Church is increasingly suffering persecution today. Christianity regularly tops the sad ranking of the world's most oppressed religious communities. There have always been, and still are, Christian martyrs in the world. In the modern Western world, the whole concept of martyrdom can seem rather alienating because most of us are only confronted with the question in theory, if at all. What would you be willing to die for? But perhaps that is not the right question. After all, Christianity is not a death cult. The Cathars believed that the devil had created the world, and that everything in it was therefore evil. Make no mistake. Ultimately, the Cathar doctrine, if you want to call it a doctrine, was anti-human, anti-life. And if you think about it, there is no shortage of doctrines today that are anti-human, anti-life. So I guess the right question to ask when we think about Christian martyrs would not be, what would you be willing to die for? But rather, what do you want to live for? And who do you want to serve with your life? For Peter of Verona, there was only one answer to this question. The one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things, visible and invisible. Thank you for watching.